There is a report today in the Telegraph which suggests that the James Bond novels are going the same way as the Roald Dahl novels. Well, the James Bond novels certainly have a great deal of rather dodgy material in them, not only in terms of direct racism, but also in terms of quotations of expressions which are fairly outre. There's in what is it, From Russia with Love, there's some fairly direct Russian quotations in the earlier part of the novel, and I remember reading that with a Russian student, a youngish lad who was learning English, and he was a little shocked, and I must say I was embarrassed. But the fact is, these books were written at a particular time when racism and certain forms of prejudice were routine. And I think to hide this now in a sanitized version would be to do a disservice to history. We will not be learning if we do not recognize that that we have advanced since the 1950s. And the same thing could be, as somebody pointed out, would I want to keep the original title of And Then There Were None, the film that was made based on an Agatha Christie novel? I think the person who pointed that out in one of the YouTube comments was extremely clever, and it was a very elegant way of referring to the book. The book has one of the most distasteful titles, I think, that one can possibly imagine. One of the most distasteful. Should we republish it? Well, I'm in two minds about this. I really think that books should keep their original material, and that as we advance, we should contextualize that, and we should add information to put that in the context of its day, rather than editing it out. And I think the same thing should go for the James Bond books. It's not just academic books that should have subtitles, that should have footnotes. I think novels after a particular period should be heavily footnoted with references to expressions that are no longer considered acceptable and that actually are not acceptable. But to excise them is to allow for the possibility of them to creep back in again, frankly. We need to know that they are wrong, and therefore we need to see them. It's a little bit like, I suppose it's a little bit like hanging a head on the pikes of the central drawbridge on London Bridge. Which if you haven't been to the church where St Magnus next to the present London Bridge, you must go, because there's a wonderful model in there, and it shows not only the tower in the centre of London Bridge with its drawbridge and the spikes on which people's heads were placed to discourage others, but there's also a chapel that was built in the centre of London Bridge, dedicated to Thomas Becket, I think. And there are so many little figures on that bridge. One of the little figures, incidentally, is a modern policeman, because one of the people who made that model was and is, I think, a policeman, and he's put himself there in a modern policeman's uniform. So I think that's rather wonderful. Anyway, I don't know if like me, you are fans of the Bond novels. I think the Bond novels are ripping yarns, and whenever I feel that I'm not terribly good at doing plot or telling stories, I look at how Ian Fleming did it, because his character development is zero, but his plot, his narrative, races along at an extraordinary speed, a little bit like a Tintin comic. Tintin is another book that I think is very much to be recommended. It's also something of its time. It's also admired in racism. And again, the Hergé is a master storyteller. His ability with character development is, again, zero, but his storytelling is remarkable. And so often with modern novels, the storytelling, with the exception of a lot of children's novels, the storytelling is awful, execrable. But the character development is very good. So we need to learn from these masters of the past, even though they are masters and mistresses with feet of clay. But if we can allow Boris Johnson to use profanities in the House of Commons, then I think we can allow and contextualise some of the appalling language and references and prejudice in evidence in the Bond books. So my thoughts on that.